Hello, I'm Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They're entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Live presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It is an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio Ms. Julia Child.
Boeuf bourguignon, French beef stew and red wine sauce. It's a perfectly delicious dish, and I included it in my cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. I also completed that recipe as my first recipe on my television show, The French Chef. I never thought that I would be on television. When we lived in Paris in the 1950s, we had trouble getting a radio station, much less television. But we read all about television in the American newspapers. How America was being taken by storm by this magic box, and people were building rumpus rooms complete with plastic bar stools and bars to accommodate it. In 1961, my husband decided to retire from government service, and we moved home to America. Well, we were excited, for we wanted to return to our native soil and learn all about the strange phenomena we had read about. Elvis the pelvis and Nixon lovers and other strange phenomena, television being the most curious. We settled in Boston, Massachusetts, and didn't even own a television when we first arrived. In fact, one day, I was off to the local public television station, and I left my husband Paul glued to the radio, listening to news about John Glenn in his little space capsule as he circled the Earth. I was on my way to promote my book at a local egghead talk show. I didn't know what I would talk about for a whole half an hour, and so I think the host was a bit surprised when I whipped out a hot plate and some eggs and began whipping up an omelet. But soon we were laughing and joking and cutting up vegetables. I was so engrossed in what I did, I forgot to mention my book. I have so much to learn about television. Now, I thought that only 5 of my friends and my butcher Jack were going to watch the show. But WGBH received 27 letters from viewers. Now, that may not sound like a lot to you, but WGBH was a fledgling station. They didn't know they had 27 viewers. And they were willing to give a whirl to a cooking show, so I was too. They cobbled together a couple of $100 of videotape and began to plan the show. Now, the executives wanted to call it something cutesy like Looking at Cooking, but I protested. My show would be called The French Chef. Now, I am not French, and I am not a chef. I'm an American home cook and proud of it. But the name was dignified, would appeal to both men and women, and was short enough to fit into the program guide without being abbreviated. I counted every letter. Now, the odds are against us. There had been cooking shows before, you see. Two of the biggest names in cooking of the day, Dionne Lucas and James Beard, had both tried cooking shows and they both flopped. My good friend James Beard was trained as an opera singer, but he was still stiff and stilted on camera. I knew what I wanted. I wanted to make cooking appeal to everyone, to take the mystique out of it, to show that anyone could cook. And if someone tried to exaggerate their own importance, they were only exalting themselves. Paul and I worked for hours on end preparing each and every show. We scripted recipes. We made charts and diagrams. We rehearsed in my kitchen. We hauled all of the things to the test kitchen in the basement of the electric building and did a rehearsal, hauled it all home and cleaned it, and hauled it all back the next day. It takes about 19 hours of hard work to make a 1/2 hour of TV. But it was exciting work. I had a lot to learn. I would swoop around the stage and expect that poor cameraman to keep up with me. It took several shows before I would realize I would have to say, "Now I'm going to walk to the oven," and then walk to the oven. But the show was successful. One by one, every public station in America picked up the show. And you could tell how successful the show was by the sales of cookware around the nation. Every time I used something on the program, it would sell out immediately. Flan rings one week, oval casseroles the next. When I cooked with broccoli, the vegetables sold out within 200 miles of every station that aired the show. And my cookbook flew off the shelves. Actually, I have this book to thank for being able to do my television show. Oh, there's no money in public broadcasting. I make about $50 a show. Caterers make more than I do. In fact, when I go out and do a demonstration at a department store, I give all that money to WGBH. People ask me why I don't go with commercial stations, but I am an educator, and I will stay with educational broadcasting. I won't even give my name to a commercial product. If their product goes downhill, my name goes downhill with it. As long as I have enough money to buy some clothes and cooking gadgets and keep my car running, I'm quite happy. And the sales of this book have done enough to provide me in that way. We didn't think it would sell. Albert Knopf, the imperious head of the company who published the book, when he heard the name Mastering the Art of French Cooking, said that he would eat his hat if anyone would buy a book with that title. Maybe I should send him some salt and pepper. The book has sold. Now, in 1974, the New York Times listed it as one of the top 100 selling books of the 20th century with 2.6 million copies sold. It still sells 18 or 20,000 books a year. And we could tell the show was successful by the awards that we received. In 1964, we went to New York to get some award. What was it? Oh, Paul was all puffed up with pride. Yes, it was the Peabody. He said it was the most prestigious award in journalism. I hadn't heard of it. And the month after that, we went back to New York to get to the East Coast ceremony for the Emmys. Our television show was the first show on educational broadcasting to win an Emmy. What we wanted to do was to show that everyone could cook. This is my passion, to use foods that are whole foods and natural foods. I love to use good butter and cream in my cooking. Oh, I'm lucky that when I learned to cook in Paris years ago, the nutrition police had not reared their ugly heads. It was all butter and cream in those days. I hear some of you don't like butter. I've read all those articles about cholesterol, and I just don't believe them. You need a little oil in your diet the way your car needs oil, or it will break down. And besides, that other alternative to butter, which I refuse to dignify by giving a name, is nothing but artificial ingredients. But I think the best advice for a healthy life is to eat plenty of fresh, healthy food and to eat in moderation. I, for one, would rather eat 2 tablespoons of chocolate mousse than an entire box of Entenmann's fat-free, tasteless concoctions. Actually, I think the only time to eat diet food is while you're waiting for the steak to cook. What I believe most in life is that our profession of the culinary arts should be a respected profession. When I arrived in America in the 1960s, the job of chef was classified as a service personnel along with street sweepers and dog catchers. There was no academic program in the nation. A few cooking classes would give you a certificate, but I worked with Boston College, and we created the first ever academic program in the culinary arts where you could get a degree in that field. Today, there are over 1,000 programs like this in the nation. And I believed it was important to create a professional association. Every profession has one. Teachers get together and talk about teaching, and doctors get together and talk about doctoring. We needed to talk about food. So I created the American Institute of Wine and Food, became the first president, and together we talk with restaurateurs and food growers and chefs about issues in food today. I also believe it's important to give young chefs an opportunity. When my good friend James Beard died, I created the James Beard Foundation, a way for young chefs to be given financial opportunities to become better chefs. We have given all kinds of young chefs opportunities. That young man, what is his name? Oh yes, Emeril Lagasse. You'll hear more about him, I'm sure, in the future. He was one man I gave a start to. And I also believe in giving women a start. For the chef, the job of chef is so often one that's been relegated to that of just men. Most of all, I believe that if you can learn to cook, you can be creative and come together. Isn't cooking what brings us together after all? Think about the good times that you have with friends and family. Isn't food always at the center of it? Food is what brings us together. It nourishes not only our bodies, but our souls. This is my invariable advice to people. Learn how to cook. Enjoy yourself. Make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and have courage. Most of all, I want you to enjoy yourself and love to cook, learn to cook. But what I want for you most is to find something that you can be passionate about. It is a shame to be caught up in something that doesn't make you absolutely tremble with joy. Thank you for sharing with me. Bon appetit, I'm Julia Child.
I'm back with Ms. Julia Child. Ms. Child, I want to thank you for taking time out of what I know is a busy schedule.
Delighted.
And being here with us today. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may, and I'd like to start by asking you, could you tell us a little bit about your experiences during World War II, because I know you were in Europe during that time.
I wasn't in Europe, actually. I was in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka.
Okay.
We didn't go to Europe until after the war. I'd wanted to join the war, of course, do my part for the war effort. I tried to join the Waves and the WACs, but I was too tall. At 6'2", they said I wouldn't fit into the bunks. So a friend of mine was able to get me a job with the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, or the Oh So Secret, I called it. And mostly I did secretarial work. I did some chores stateside. One thing I did was work on an emergency signaling mirror for pilots down at sea. They would be given, I have a sample I could show you right here. It's this little mirror that the pilots could use to signal when they were down at sea. I'm very proud of this, in fact, that I worked on that. But when an opening came up in Ceylon, I jumped at the chance, let me tell you. My job was to operate the registry. All the spies in Burma, in Ceylon, and India, and China sent me their reports, and I sifted through them.
Were these American spies?
Yeah, spies of the Allies, Allied spies, yes. And they would send me their information. I would look for patterns and repeating things and things that seemed to make sense, and I would cull those into a report and send that to Washington. But actually, it sometimes got boring. I would get very angry when Washington wouldn't reply quickly enough, and I would say to them things like, if you don't reply quickly, the next missive will be in Chinese with a virulent bacteriological disease. So my Colonel Hefner said that my sense of humor kept things going there.
Did you meet your husband during the war?
I certainly did. We were stationed, actually, we had taken over an old tea plantation. And so we had these buildings around this sort of compound. And my compound looked right across into Paul Child's office. He was an artist. He had been recruited to make a war room for General Mountbatten. And that was his job during the war. We were, the OSS days were our best periods of our life. All of us agreed. The OSS was created by Wild Bill Donovan. And it wasn't just people who were spies. It was people who were cartographers and jugglers and burglars and circus entertainers and writers and all sorts of interesting people. And we would meet and talk and go about and have elephant rides and eat the local cuisine. And it was quite an exciting time for us.
That was. Sounds like
Eventually, we went to China then, Kunming, China, at the end of the war.
Did you return? You returned to the United States
The
after
war was
the war?
over. Paul and I had already begun our romance, but we weren't quite far enough along to be married at that point. And so we both came home to America, to our respective coasts. I was from Pasadena, California, and he was from Boston. And so we continued to write, but soon agreed to marry shortly after the war. And then he got a job in government service with working for the embassies, not as the ambassador, but he was a public service officer. And we came back to France in '48.
Okay, and that is where you figured out that your passion was cooking?
That is so, actually. I had taken a cooking course in Pasadena from some English women. Do you know anything about English cooking? That was a recipe for disaster. They taught me to make things like pancakes, but I wasn't very good at it. When we got to Paris, we loved Paul's work, and we had many friends, and we had a whirlwind of activities. We traveled and bought a car and went to the countryside, but I wanted to do something significant with my life. Paul was worried too. One day someone at work asked him, what did Julia like to do? And art or music or sports? And he thought about it and said, she likes to eat. So he came home with the address for L'École de Cordon Bleu in his hand, the Cordon Bleu cooking school. And so I went for a demonstration to see what it was like and was immediately enthusiastic and signed up for a 6-week cooking class. My French was so bad, I didn't know I signed up for a 6-month cooking class. But it took almost a month of Paul's meager salary, but we agreed it was important to my self-esteem and I would forge ahead and take the class.
So tell us a little bit about what your experience was in training at the Cordon Bleu school.
Well, I had a wonderful, wonderful teacher, Chef Bougnard, Max Bougnard. He'd studied with the great Escoffier in London. He had such enthusiasm, and that enthusiasm was transferred to all of us. I did not, however, have a good experience with the owner of the school, Madame Brassard. She hazed me by putting me in a class entirely of men, all American GIs, who treated me like I was invading their boys' school. But I was not going to let those men stop me from doing what I wanted to do. And soon we were a jolly crew. So we all took lessons with Chef Bougnard, and every day I'd be up at 6 in the morning. I would go for my morning lesson and do some shopping at the market and go home and make lunch for Paul, go back to school for an afternoon demonstration where I'd be so inspired I would cook in my own kitchen until midnight. That was my life for several years. Before Cordon Bleu, I had lived a butterfly life of fun, but it was the Cordon Bleu and the restaurants and markets of Paris that taught me that cooking was a rich an endlessly varied topic and one I could spend my entire life studying.
And we're all glad that you did. So did you and or your husband, Paul, gain any weight during this period?
Oh, I suppose I did. As I said in the presentation that I gave, that I believe that you should use butter and cream. I will always use those good real items in my cooking. And yes, in later years I've had to cut back on some of those things, but...
Well, speaking of your book, that was a fairly involved and lengthy process of writing the book and I guess ultimately in getting it published. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
I had met two women at a cooking club. There are many cooking clubs for men all through the city, only one for women. But there we talked passionately about food, and I met two of my dearest friends, Simone Beck, or Simka, as I call her, and Lisouette. And together the three of us talked about cooking, and we began our own cooking school for Americans visiting Paris in my kitchen. So we did that for several years, and they had been working on a cookbook. And they needed an American collaborator. They wanted to write a French cookbook for an American market to teach Americans French cooking. But they needed an American collaborator. And I jumped at the chance. I threw myself into the project and found myself working sometimes 18-hour days, testing and retesting recipes, changing things from grams to tablespoons and teaspoons. And I found cookery bookery so fascinating I wanted to keep at it for years.
Was that well, as far as the cost of doing that and cooking 18 hours a day, was that prohibitive in because you were in Paris, correct?
I could tell you there were many a times we had several batches of the same thing over and over again. It was somewhat prohibitive. I kept my cooking school going, and Paul kept working as well. And then, of course, Paul was moved throughout Europe. We didn't stay at Paris. We went to Marseille, and then we went to Bonn, Germany, and Oslo, Norway. And so much of our work was done by letters and communications. And actually, I think that helped, though, eventually translating to the book, having to write things down. Well, we had been working for 7 years when Houghton Mifflin, who'd given us an advance, wanted to see some results. I was nervous. All we had was 800 pages and nothing but soups and sauces, not even main dishes yet. But I believed in what we were doing. We were doing something worthwhile. But Houghton Mifflin rejected our book. We were all devastated, I can tell you. But I have a friend. Her name is Avis Devoto, and she secretly continued to send my book manuscript to publishers. It landed on the desks at Knopf Publishing, a young woman named Judith Jones. Now, Judith had already made her name in publishing because she had discovered a book called The Diary of Anne Frank. But it was going to be rejected, and she picked it out of the rejection pile and made sure it got published. So she had made her name already. But she was also a gourmet cook. And she realized that this book was something significant. And so Knopf published the book in 1962.
Well, at this time, I'd like to announce that this isn't really Julia Child. This is actually Karen Veronch.
I can start talking like this.
Fayetteville.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you can get out of the Julia voice.
I can get out of the Julia voice. Thank you very much.
It's not easy, I think, to carry that voice for so long. But Karen, thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Julia Child is one of our new characters for History Live. And so I want to ask you a few things related to Julia Child and your research. But first thing I want to ask you is there's sort of a mythology that she was a spy or her husband was a spy during the war. Tell us a little bit about it.
I would like to address that, Mark, because people are adamant about it. And you see, what happened was when the Freedom of Information Act released all the OSS files, of all these lists of names, Julia was the most famous. And all these newspaper reporters across America just wanted to have some cute title to hang their story on. So you'd read headlines like "The Spy That Fed Me" or such and such, Julia Child was a spy the way a school secretary is an educator. Certainly she worked for the spy agency. Certainly, if everybody who works for that spy agency is a spy, then yeah, I guess she was. She never did any undercover spy work. That was not her job. Her job was to run the registry. And again,
I guess she wouldn't have been all that inconspicuous.
Well, that's one of the lines that I say in my monologue. It's difficult for a tall, red-headed woman to be inconspicuous and say China. Right. So no, I mean that was not her job. She was not the cloak and dagger with the hat and the trench coat. But she worked for the spy agency, and all the spies sent her the information. She plowed through it. She was basically a secretary, an administrator, is what she was. So she worked for the OSS, absolutely. She never did any spy work. Her record, her OSS service record, is actually available online. All those records are at College Park, Maryland, in the National Archives. You can go to College Park or you can write to them and get the archives, but some of the archives that are very popular, you can actually just download right on the computer, and I have. So I've read through her entire service record. There's no time ever that she's, away with leave or away mysteriously. She is on staff, on duty, at the tea plantation in Candy, Ceylon, every day. I mean, she's never off doing a secret mission. So that was not her job. She worked for the spy agency, but she was a secretary.
Right. Well, and from the time that she was like you say, sort of dumped into this class of all men in Paris, and then she was a pioneer in television.
She certainly was.
I don't know that she, I don't know if she felt or thought of herself as a feminist or not, and it doesn't matter. But I mean, I didn't realize until your monologue that her show, the French Chef, was the first public broadcasting television show to ever win an Emmy, which is pretty cool. But talk a little bit just about the length of time, the period of time that she had TV shows going on.
Oh, she dies in 2004, and she had her last TV show, which was well, she was involved at that time in 2001. They were beginning the Food Network. It was early days, and she was already fairly infirm. But she would do a weekly 2-minute news clip on that show because she to support it and get it started. And then of course MTV bought it out and it exploded.
I mean, I still watch Baking with Julia.
Right. She had a number of different shows. The French Chef 1 and the French Chef 2, but then she had Baking with Julia, Julia Child and Company, Julia Child and Friends, Julia Child Presents. I mean, she had 5 or 6 different shows, each one accompanied by a cookbook, that's where she made her money, and she made a lot of money on her cookbooks. Eventually, she does go to commercial television. At one point, the New York public broadcasting station dropped her show, and her line was, "If you ain't out of New York, you ain't nowhere," because she felt she couldn't sell books if she wasn't out of New York City. So, so she goes at that point. She goes to ABC. And she's on David Letterman for a while. She's in Time magazine. She's in Parade magazine. I mean, she was a force to be reckoned with. In the 1960s, historians have said they called the Big Three of people who changed food. It was Julia Child, James Beard, and Craig Claiborne, who was the food editor for the New York Times. They are considered to be the big 3 that changed food. Certainly, then you get into the 80s with people like Alice Waters, and people who have made this whole local food movement. And Alice Waters was the California restaurateur who really encouraged local food to be made into something special. And she's still around, in fact. But it was Julia who paved the way. I mean, she really changed. The 1950s were a really low point in cooking for America. Right. It was all canned food and frozen food, and the frozen food in those days was nowhere like near frozen food today. I mean, frozen food, you can get decent things today. Right. So she really woke America up. And then, of course, people were traveling to Europe after the war. The other thing that helped was that the Kennedys had a French chef, René Verdun, and he was a good friend of Julia Child's, and that made people go, oh, let's learn more about French food. So they were sort of celebrities in America.
Okay, well, I know that there's the famous skit from Saturday Night Live with Dan Aykroyd portraying.
1979 that was.
Okay, and did she see that?
She loved it. She kept a copy on a videotape and made anybody who come to see her watch it. But sometimes she performed it herself. So she thought it was hysterical. Yeah. She loved those kinds of parodies, and she would say, it was all thing like he cut himself, and then and she'd fall to the floor, save the liver, and she dies. And she would perform the whole thing. She thought it was very funny. Yeah. People often made parodies. One time she actually even led the Boston Pops Orchestra using a wooden spoon. She stepped in and conducted the orchestra. So she was fun, and she had a great personality and great style on television.
Yeah, and here in the last 30 seconds or so, the Julie
and Julia movie.
Yeah, and blog. She was aware of the blog.
She was aware of the blog before she died. She didn't like it because she felt that this woman was trying to tag onto her apron strings and get a bit of a publicity, because her name was the same. I mean, and so she didn't. She was always suspicious of people using that. But it's a wonderful movie because it's brought Julia back to us. Yeah. I would recommend the book My Life in France.
Okay. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Karen, for being here, and thank you for watching History Alive.